Exodus chapter 3. We will continue. We're going to pick up in verse 13, not 12, verse 13. We actually got through 12. We will go back and read 12 in a few moments, but I want to start with chapter 3 and verse 13. We'll go ahead and read through the end of the chapter. We'll actually go further, but just to kind of give us a sense of where we're going. Moses said to God, "Indeed, when I come to the children of Israel and I say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they say to me, what is his name? What shall I say to them?" And God said to Moses, "I am who I am." And he said, "Thus you shall say to the children of Israel, I am has sent me to you." Moreover, God said to Moses, "Thus you shall say to the children of Israel, the Lord God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob has sent me to you. This is my name forever. This is my memorial to all generations. Go and gather the elders of Israel together and say to them, the Lord God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, appeared to me, saying, I have surely visited you, and I have seen what is done to you in Egypt, and I have said, I will bring you up out of the affliction of Egypt to the land of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites, to a land flowing with milk and honey. And then they will heed your voice, and you shall come, you and the elders of Israel, to the king of Egypt, and you shall say to him, the Lord God of the Hebrews has met with us. And now please let us go 3 days' journey into the wilderness that we may sacrifice the Lord our God. But I'm sure that the king of Egypt will not let you go. No, not even by a mighty hand. So I will stretch out my hand and I will strike Egypt with all my wonders, which I shall do in its midst. And after that, he will let you go. And I will give this people favor in the sight of the Egyptians. And it shall be when you go that you shall not go empty handed, but every woman shall ask of her neighbor, namely of her who dwells near her house, articles of silver, articles of gold, and clothing, and you shall put them on your sons and on your daughters. So you shall plunder the Egyptians. So basically, God is giving Abraham a grand overview of everything that's about to happen. Now, Moses was certainly a man who responded to God pretty reluctantly, pretty cautiously. We looked at that a couple of weeks ago. He seemed a little unsure and not at all ready to jump on the task that God had called him to. But in verse number 12, and let me just read that to you, chapter 3 and verse 12, God said, I will certainly be with you, and it'll be a sign to you that I have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall serve God in this mountain. So God had promised, and this is where we ended 2 weeks ago, God had promised to Moses that even though I'm not giving you a preliminary sign, when you get to the mountain, Mount Sinai, and you are worshiping me there, you will realize that indeed I am doing what I promised that I would do. So he had promised Moses that he would be with them and that the Hebrews would come out of Egypt. And that was good. That was helpful, but it wasn't good enough for Moses. He wanted a little bit more information. So in this section that we're looking at today, Moses is going to ask for more information. Before I go do this, I want to know a little bit more about the mission and what exactly I'm supposed to say and kind of all the details. So that's why God gives him this kind of grand overview. In this section, God is actually going to talk more than Moses. And by the way, I would say that's a good prayer plan for all of us. Let God talk more than us, because God certainly knows what he's talking about more than we do. Um, Moses is going to protest, but his protests are going to be short. But he really does. This is not just playing games. He really does feel inadequate. It really feels like he's 80 years old, and he really feels like, I'm not sure I'm the guy for the job. So he's going to identify his insecurities with his questions, and then God is going to reply. Now, though Moses' questions are going to be short, God is going to give rather lengthy replies. He's going to try to fill in all the blanks for Moses so Moses can feel pretty good about what he is carrying out. The fact that God speaks so much here, I think, has some pretty interesting significance. And that is, and this is important, that God is a God of words or word before deeds. The New Testament says that God will confirm his word with signs and wonders. One of the really tragic things that has happened in the church in the last 60 years is much of the church has become a church chasing after signs and wonders and less interested in the word. But God speaks his word first, and he confirms his word with signs and wonders. God is going to reveal his name. He's going to reveal his nature, his capacities, his foreknowledge. God is going to reveal his intentions. He's going to reveal all of that before he does anything. And so there's this little thing that we need to understand about God. God speaks, then God acts. And I want you to think about creation. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was chaotic, it was without form and void. And God said, "Let there be," and then he acted. All right. So he spoke first. His word spoke, and his word was followed by action. Um, God will, in this text, speak before he actually acts. Now, let's go to just verses 13, 14, and 15, kind of laser in here now. So Moses said to God, "Indeed, when I come to the children of Israel and I say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they say to me, what is his name? What shall I say to them?" And God said to Moses, "I am who I am." And he said, "Thus you shall say to the children of Israel, I am has sent me to you. Moreover, God said to Moses, thus you shall say to the children of Israel, the Lord God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name forever, and this is my memorial in all generations." So Moses says, okay, I'm going to go. Let me be straight, God. Let me be clear. I'm supposed to go to the elders of Israel, and I'm supposed to say, hey, God talked to me. You haven't seen me for 40 years, but God talked to me. And God told me that I'm to tell you that I'm supposed to go to Pharaoh and tell him to let you go. So it's a fair question Moses has when they ask me, well, who sent you? What am I supposed to respond? It's almost like Moses is saying, so God, if I do go, I'm not promising you, God, that I will go, but if I do go, who am I supposed to tell them has commissioned me to do this? It's funny because I put this in the notes. The fact is, he's borrowing trouble because they never do ask him. I mean, we tend to do that. God, what if, what if, what if? And most of our what ifs don't even happen. And this what if doesn't even happen. But what if they say, who commissioned you? And it was like Moses was afraid to say, well, I heard this guy talk to me in a bush and he told me. He was kind of afraid that wouldn't be enough. So he wanted some clarification. I've got to have something more than I saw a bush burning and there was a voice that came out of the bush. Now, there is a kind of a question I want us just to reflect on for a few minutes. Who is it? And I'm not going to give you an answer because I don't know the answer myself. Um, and for that, you should probably fire me because I don't have the answer. We have speculation, is all we have. Who is it that doesn't know God's name? Does Moses not know God's name? Like, who are you? Is it the Hebrews that don't know God's name? Is it possible that neither of them know God's name? Now, keep in mind before we jump to this, oh, no, it couldn't be the Hebrews. They've been slaves in Egypt for 430 years. Remember what Judges 2:10 says? Judges 2:10 says there arose a generation after Joshua died, there arose a generation that did not know God nor the works that he had done. In other words, in one generation, they had forgotten God. Is it not possible that They don't even know who this God is. 430 years is a long time. And it is also possible that Moses didn't know it. Moses was raised in the Pharaoh's palace. It's almost like he's saying, I need a password here. Who is this God that is speaking for me? So there's some question about who it is that doesn't know the name. It doesn't really matter. But God says, I am that I am. And I did the tetragram up there on, we won't go through that again, the Yahweh and Jehovah. Um, but it seems most likely in this context that God is wanting to encourage Moses, to encourage the people, that God is saying that I am the God who causes what is to be. In other words, I'm the God in charge. This is the God that is speaking. I am the God that is in charge. It would give them hope. It's not just some God like the Nile River or the frogs that we'll talk about later had their own patron God. I'm the God that causes things to be. I'm the one that is sovereign. I'm the one that is in charge. That seems to be what God is saying to Moses. A.W. Tozer says that God is declaring that he is self existent. He needs no one, but when faith is present, he works through anyone. It's a great line. I am that I am is saying, nobody's propping me up. I'm self-existent. I don't need anybody else's help. This is off the notes for a moment. That great passage, I think it's in Isaiah 40, when God is talking to Judah about their inclination to serve idols. And he really kind of rebukes them and ridicules them for serving idols. And he says things like a wealthy man gets takes his gold and has somebody who is a gold maker, gold worker, to make an idol for him. If he's a little less wealthy, he uses silver. And if he's really poor, he chops down a piece of wood and takes it to a craftsman to make a god. And they have to make it really good so that it doesn't totter. It doesn't. And God is kind of chiding the people of Israel. I don't need anybody to make me. You don't have to get a piece of gold, slab of gold, and have somebody carve me out. You don't have to take a block of wood and make sure I don't totter. God is saying, I'm self existent. I don't need anybody or anything to make me who I am. Let me give you a real theological piece here. If God needs anything, people even say God needs us. God does not need us. He doesn't need us to worship him. He doesn't need us to have communion. If God needs anything, then there's something greater than God. So the God we serve is completely self-existent and needs nothing or no one, but he will use anyone who has faith in him. That's what Tozer's comment makes. So some have even said, is God kind of dancing around the name, or is he revealing something significant about himself? Golden Gate says that Moses asked God about God's name, and God actually gives him a theology, not a name. God says, I will always be what you and your people need me to be. All of that's kind of captured in that I am what I am. So Moses says, who am I supposed to say sent me? And God says, I will be whatever you need me to be. Tell the elders, I've got this. All right. Verse 16. So he gives him further directions. Go and gather the elders of Israel together. Say to them, the Lord God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, appeared to me, saying, I have surely visited you, and I've seen what is done to you in Egypt. And I have said, I will bring you up out of affliction of Egypt to the land of the Canaanites, and then all of the other ites that we have read already, to a land flowing with milk and honey. And then this is what God says to Moses: they, the elders, will heed your voice. And you shall come, you and the elders of Israel, to the king of Egypt, and you will say to him, the Lord God of the Hebrews has met with us. And now please let us go 3 days' journey into the wilderness that we may sacrifice to the Lord our God. And then God says, but I am sure that the king of Egypt will not let you go. No, not even by a mighty hand. So I will stretch out my hand and I will strike Egypt with all my wonders, which I will do in its midst. And after that, he will let you go. Well, what a great task. I want you to go and do this, and it's not going to work. I mean, that's basically what go and tell him to let people go, and he's going to say, no way. All right. So here's kind of what God breaks down to him: go to the elders and tell them what I am going to do. And then he says, and they will listen to you. Now, look at chapter 4 in verse 1. Moses answered and said, but suppose they will not believe me or listen to my voice. Suppose they say the Lord has not appeared to you. We'll read that again later. And then in verse 8, then it will be God, this is God saying, if they don't believe you, nor heed the message of the first sign, that they may believe the message of the latter sign. So even though God says they will believe you, they are reluctant. When we get there, they will be a little reluctant to believe this guy that has been gone for 40 years. And then he says, this is interesting. I want you to tell, when you get to Pharaoh, this is part of the story we don't normally talk about. I want you to tell Pharaoh that you want to just go out and worship for 3 days. Now, to some, that seems deceptive. Is God telling Moses? Because that wasn't God's plan. God wasn't planning on them just to go out for 3 days and worship. But he says to him anyway, he's not going to believe you, so I am going to work on your behalf. So it's kind of an interesting little piece. What is God doing when he says, tell him you want to worship for 3 days? Is that testing the waters? Is that just building up the frustration and the anger of Pharaoh? Not really sure, but that's the instructions that God gives. But what is clear is the foreknowledge of God. He knows what's going to happen. I mean, he says he's not going to let you go, not even with a strong hand. That strong hand is going to be the first nine plagues. Water's going to turn to blood, and frogs are going to come creeping into refrigerators and beds, and lice are going to be everywhere, and gnats and boils on the bodies, and it's going to be so dark that you can feel it. All that stuff. Not even with a strong hand, he's not even going to let you go when I do all of that. It's not going to be until that final plague, the taking of the oldest of every son. So the foreknowledge of God is really clear here. And again, we're not going to litigate this all over again, but there is that tension between predestination and foreknowledge. And we always talk about, so if God knows it already, what does it even matter? And of course, my argument is always there's a difference between God knowing and God choosing. He happens to know what our choices will be, but he doesn't force those choices on us. But because he's God, he knows what those choices will be. But it's clear here that God has foreknowledge. He knows what is about to happen. So verse 21, chapter 3, and I will give this people favor in the sight of the Egyptians. And it shall be when you go that you shall not go empty handed, that every woman shall ask of her neighbor, namely of her who dwells near the house, articles of silver, articles of gold, and clothing, and you shall put them on your sons and your daughters, so you shall plunder the Egyptians. So God has given the whole picture here. He says you're going to go to Pharaoh, and you're going to say, we're going to go worship for 3 days, and he's going to say, no chance, and he's not going to be moved, not even with strong hand, not even with the 9 plagues. But then God says, but I am going to bring you out. And when I bring you out, you're going to be blessed. You're going to have clothing on your back. You're going to have gold and silver. You're going to have all kinds of stuff. So God is giving him the entire picture ahead of time. Now, let me just a little sidebar. God does not always, even in Moses' life, do that. And he certainly doesn't always do it in our lives. How many would prefer if God called you to do something that was a little risky, that he would tell you every step of the way what was going to happen and how well it was going to work out at the end. And you were going to leave town rich and prosperous with new clothes. We would all like that if he would do that ahead of time. All right. He doesn't always do that. Michael's all about that. He's for that. Okay. He doesn't do that all the time. He didn't do it for Moses all the time. But he does do that for Moses here. What is interesting is Genesis 15:14, when God called Abraham, and he told Abraham that I'm going to bring you back to this place, your family, but you're going to be long gone. You're going to be dead. It's going to be 430 years, and I'm going to bring them back here. But God says, I'm going to punish the nation. This is Genesis 15. I'm going to punish the nation that they, your family members, Abraham, serve as slaves. And afterward, they're going to come out with great possessions. God promised that more than 4 centuries before. They're going to come out with stuff. Now, certainly they would be, they would be due some reparations after all of those years of slavery and abuse. And they're going to come out. He talks about the clothing on their back. Now, what's interesting is the children are going to come out with clothing on their back. Later, it's going to be a few weeks down the road, we're going to hear Pharaoh compromise with Moses. And he's going to say, okay, I'll let the adults go, but the children have to stay back. Well, obviously, if Pharaoh only lets children go, he knows the parents are going to come back. But Moses is going to say, no, we will go with our young and our old, our sons and our daughters, and with our flocks and herds, because we are to celebrate a festival to the Lord. And in chapter 10, Pharaoh is going to say, the Lord be with you. If I let you go along with your women and children, clearly, Pharaoh says, you're bent on evil. No, have only the men go and worship the Lord, since that's what you've been asking for. And then he drives Moses and Aaron out of their presence. So there's going to be this tension that's going to go on between. But God's promise is when you leave, finally, when you leave, you're going to go out with stuff. Okay, now I'm fast forwarding, kind of a spoiler alert for those who don't know, but I'm guessing most of you do know that when they finally do come out of Egypt with the Passover, God is going to tell them all, go to the Egyptian's house and ask them for clothing and gold and silver, and they're going to get it. And when they go out, they're going to go out with a whole bunch of stuff, just as God has promised that they will do. So Moses is given the rundown by God, the big picture, what's going to happen really from start to finish, just in those few little verses. Chapter 4, all right, verse 1. Moses answered and said, but suppose they will not believe me or listen to my voice. Suppose they say the Lord has not appeared to you. The Lord said to him, what is that in your hand? He's so patient with Moses. And he said, a rod. And he said, cast it on the ground. So he cast it on the ground. It became a serpent. And Moses fled from it. Then the Lord said to Moses, reach out your hand and take it by the tail. And he reached out his hand and caught it. And it became a rod in his hand, that they may believe that the Lord God of their fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, has appeared to you. Furthermore, the Lord said to him, now put your hand in your bosom. He put his hand in his bosom, took it out. Behold, his hand was leprous, like snow. And he said, put your hand in your bosom again. So he put it in his bosom again, drew it out of his bosom, and behold, it was restored like his other flesh. Then it will be, if they do not believe you nor heed the message of the first sign, that they may believe the message of the latter sign. And it shall be, if they do not believe even these two signs or listen to your voice, that you shall take water from the river, and you will pour it on dry land, and the water which you take from the river will become blood on the dry land. So Moses wants more guarantees. Okay. Thank you for telling me the whole story. But what if they don't believe me? I mean, can you just imagine this conversation going on? And instead of rebuking him, he gives him 3 signs. The staff becomes a snake and a staff again. Cobras, by the way, were a sign often worn on the crown of kings. They were deities in Egypt. So this would prove powerful. God is saying, I'm in charge. I'm over even the deities of Egypt. Then the second sign, something healthy, stick your hand in your bosom, becomes harmful and then healthy again. Take it out, it's leprous, put it back in, it's whole again. Egypt was notoriously unhealthy, and leprosy in their land was deemed incurable. So God is saying, look, I'm going to make your hand leprous, put it back in, I'm going to make it whole. And thirdly, something pure, water, becomes something putrid with no reversal. It just becomes blood and put on hold. The Nile, the water, was at the core of Egypt's wealth and fertility, and the Nile was considered itself a god. So God is giving them three very specific signs. It is also interesting that the staff and the blood will be part of the encounter with Pharaoh. He will use his staff and to smite the waters that will become blood. And leprosy will appear again in Numbers chapter 12 when Miriam is stricken with leprosy. Motyer also points out that these signs were also for Moses. He says, taking the snake by the tail may have been the bravest thing Moses had ever done. And that's not just speculation. When it became a snake, it says Moses ran from it. So God is saying, Moses, I'm going to give you courage. Now pick that thing up by its tail, and it became a staff again. The leprosy would make him unworthy before God, something he already believed. So this would show him that God could make him worthy in the first place. You don't have to make yourself worthy. Let me make you leprous so you're unworthy, and let me heal that. God is saying, I can take your inabilities and your lack of health and your lack of worthiness, and I can make you worthy. And even the Nile, he was saying to Moses, even the Nile River is no opposition to God. I'm going to have you mark out two letters in this next statement because it's a really good point. Signs and wonders um, come up in this section, and they're also a New Testament concept. And there are, to be fair, there are times that signs and wonders are almost synonymous. So I don't want to make this hard, fast distinction. That's wouldn't be faithful to the text. But Hamilton speaks of signs being to, and it shouldn't say unbelievers, so scratch out UN. Hamilton says it seems like that signs are to believers. It's like the sign to Moses of the snake, the rod becoming a snake and then picking it back up and becoming a rod was a sign to him to give him faith and encouragement. So and to Moses, the sign, put your hand in your bosom, it becomes leprous, put it back in, it becomes whole, encouraged him. It was sign encouraged faith in Moses, whereas wonders are revealed to unbelievers to incite fear. Wonders are to, whoa, this God is beyond our capabilities of withstanding. So I think that's an interesting note as well. Verse 10. Um, Then Moses said to the Lord, oh, my Lord, I am not eloquent. It was a really cool thing that the staff became a snake and now a staff, but I can't talk very well. So he still got questions, all right? I'm not eloquent, neither before nor since you have spoken to your servant, but I'm slow of speech, I'm slow of tongue. So the Lord said to him, who has made man's mouth? Or who makes the mute, the deaf, the seeing, or the blind? Have not I, the Lord? Now therefore go, and I will be with your mouth, and I will teach you what you will say. But then he said, oh, my Lord, please send by the hand of whomever else you may send. And now the Lord's had enough. Verse 14. So the anger of the Lord was kindled against Moses, and he said, is not Aaron the Levite your brother? I know that he can speak well. And look, he's also coming out to meet you. When he sees you, he will be glad in his heart. Now you shall speak to him, put words in his mouth, and I will be with your mouth and with his mouth, and I will teach you what you shall do. So he shall be your spokesman to the people, and he himself shall be as a mouth for you, and you shall be to him as God. And you shall take this rod in your hand with which you shall do the signs. So Moses now, after being given the whole story, after being given three pretty cool signs, he is still reluctant. And he doubts now his giftedness to speak. This, by the way, will be the last attempt to skirt his call because it will arouse the Lord's anger. And I think he will realize I better stop while I'm sort of ahead. Now the question is, um, was this just an excuse of Moses? Or did he really have a speech defect, which is likely the reason? It may be simply that he doesn't feel like he can express well in Hebrew to the elders, because this is really primarily what they're talking about here, because he's been in Egypt and in Midian so long. Can I just tell you, you've if you've ever been around people that speak another language, communication is really crucial. We'll tell the story later, but our dear Pastor Josh did not get his e-visa ahead of time because, and we went ahead and went at the direction of leadership that said you can get a visa in the airport at Burkina Faso, and that was not so easy. We're lucky that we're not lucky. We're blessed that Josh is back with us. His eyes got really big, and they wouldn't let me go talk to him. And he's standing over there with a guy with a gun, telling him he's going to get sent home. And it's now a funny story, but it was not a funny story in the moment. All right. But communication is so important. I finally was trying to communicate with this guy speaking French and trying to understand that he said you have to have an invitation, and we had one, but it wasn't in writing. And when we got it, it wasn't in writing in the right language. And so anyway, finally he got it, and he's back, and we don't have to replace him in Hartford City. So all's good. All right. But anyway, the point is communication. Maybe he was just saying, I don't know that I can communicate the elders. I've been out of this Hebrew language so long. Maybe he was just nervous and anxious. Victor Hamilton said it may have been all four. But he does seem to be pretty eloquent when he's arguing with God, doesn't he? All right. He doesn't want to do talking beyond that, but he's got all the questions when it comes to God. But God is not surprised. And he promises to work through the weakness of Moses. He does not heal his speech impediment, but he does work through his weakness. And again, what a lesson here. We could just park here for a few minutes. We'll just take a few seconds instead. But God delights in working through our weakness. Um, we human beings, when we are working in our strength, we have this tendency when there's success to walk away and say, "Look what I did." But when we are working in our weakness and God works through us and there's success, our tendency is to say, "Look what God did," because there's no way I could have done that. And that was the case. God delighted in working through the weakness of Moses. So, so Moses says, "Send whomever you will." It's almost like he's saying, "Send anyone else, just not me." All right, that seems to be what Moses. I forget where I read this, or I would have given the um, reference to it, but it's not mine. Um, it may just be something I heard and I put it in the notes, but it's almost as Moses is turning God's words on God and saying, I I will be who I will be. It's like, this is all I got, God. I can't speak well. God has said, I am who I am. And it's like Moses is saying, I will be who I will be, or who I am. So anyway, send whomever you will. God is angry then. But he concedes to send Aaron, who is a gifted communicator, so gifted, by the way, that when they get tired of Moses being on the mountain too long, that he is able to convince all the people to bring all of their jewelry and all their wealth and all of their gold and silver and throw it in the fire and make a golden calf to worship. All right. He was a very gifted communicator. And then he tried to talk. He was a gifted communicator enough to try to talk himself out of that mess. Remember what he said to Moses when Moses came down and saw the golden calf? I don't know what happened. We threw it in the fire and poof, this calf came. So we go from this uneloquent Moses to this very smooth talking Aaron. Might have been better had Moses acknowledged his weakness and just let God work through him. Nevertheless, it was Aaron. The question is this plan B for God? And was he surprised? And we have to say, theologically, no, he was not surprised. He works through our choices, but he still completes his purpose. That is so crucial to our understanding. J.I. Packer, who is a reformed, or he's passed now, was a reformed theologian, said, the unceasing activity of the Creator, whereby in overflowing bounty and goodwill, he upholds his creatures in ordered existence. In other words, God will accomplish his plan even through his creatures that sometimes fall very short. Aaron is not plan B. He is miraculous. He's not plan B. He's not miraculous intervention. He is divine provision that God has prepared in his foreknowledge. In God's foreknowledge, he knew Aaron was going to back, or Moses was going to say, I can't do it. Wasn't that God didn't, again, I'm giving you my theology. I don't think God said, as he was writing this story ahead of time, I'm going to pick Moses, but I don't really want Moses to do it. So I'm going to tell Moses he has to complain about his speech and then because I really want Aaron to do it. I don't think that's what happened. God in his foreknowledge knew that Moses was going to make the choice that I don't think I can do it. So God in his foreknowledge is going to complete his purpose. And so it's not plan B. Aaron is in place. God says Aaron's already on his way. It's like, God, I knew you were going to do this, Moses. And Aaron is already on his way. He's not surprised by the need of Moses. And let me just say, he is not surprised by our needs or our weaknesses either. And provision is always on the way for us. The words and the staff, especially the staff, are the reminder of his covenant and his promise. The staff is not a magic wand. It is a reminder of the covenant that God has made with Israel. Verse 18. We're going to wind down here. So Moses went. So Aaron's come. Moses went and he returned to Jethro, it's his father in law. And he said to him, please let me go and return to my brethren who are in Egypt and see whether they are still alive. Jethro said to Moses, look at this, go in peace. And the Lord said to Moses in Midian, go return to Egypt, for all the men who sought your life are dead. And Moses took his wife and his sons, and he set them on a donkey, and he returned to the land of Egypt, and Moses took the rod of God in his hand. And the Lord said to Moses, when you go back to Egypt, see that you do all the wonders before Pharaoh, which I put in your hand, but I will harden his heart so that he will not let the people go. Then you shall say to Pharaoh, thus saith the Lord, Israel is my son, my firstborn. So I say to you, let my son go, that he may serve me. But if you refuse to let him go, indeed, I will kill your son, your firstborn. So again, God is giving him the preview of all that is going to happen. Notice in verse 18, Moses, who has been tending his father-in-law's sheep for 4 decades, Moses now, after this encounter, goes back to his father-in-law and he said, I need to resign. I need to go to Egypt and I need to check on my people. He doesn't seem to give a lot of detail. Keep in mind, this would be a great loss to Jethro. He would lose one of his primary um, servants. It would be permanent for Jethro, but such grace. Go in peace. Remember when Jacob wanted to leave his father-in-law Laban? He was married to Rachel, and he wanted to leave his father-in-law. His father-in-law did everything he could to twist and deceive and keep him there and chased after him. What a total opposite picture here. Jethro, who will later give Moses some really great advice too, but Jethro says, it was like Jethro could see that was what was on his heart. He said, go in peace. And then God gives further instruction to Moses in verse 19 and 20. The Lord said to Moses in Midian, go return to Egypt, for all the men who sought your life are dead. I thought this was interesting because remember when Jesus is born, this is in Matthew 2, he is born, and God speaks to Joseph in a dream um, and tells him to flee to Egypt. And he flees to Egypt, and because Herod is trying to kill him. And then God speaks to him after Herod dies and says it's okay to go back now. It's that kind of thing. God is saying it's okay now. The people that sought your life, that Pharaoh is dead. You can go back to Egypt. Take your family and go. And then God tells him what to expect. When you get there, Pharaoh's not going to let you go easy. And I'm going to we will be talking about the hardening of Pharaoh's heart for the next several weeks. I'm going to give you a preview here. The first, I think, 6 times, if I remember correctly, the first 6 times it's going to say Pharaoh hardened his heart. And then the next time it's going to say his heart was hardened. And then from the rest of the story, it will begin to say God hardened his heart. All right, that's going to be important because the first several, now this is preview. This is God saying, I will, because that is the final act. God will harden his heart. Sometimes people read this, they read the preview, and they fail to read the story. In the story itself, Pharaoh hardens his heart first, 6 times. And then it says his heart was hard, and then God hardens the heart, almost like the final act. People read this, and well, that doesn't seem fair, but we need to take the entire context in mind. Let me read you this 2 or 3 paragraphs, and this is we'll be talking about this a lot. But Shira Schechter argues that Pharaoh's heart was hardened by God because of previous choices he had made to enslave, torture, and abuse Israel, and that early moral choices made future choices and hardening inevitable. Let me just read these 3 paragraphs. Pharaoh's story demonstrates how the repeated choice to enslave others ultimately enslaved him to his own corrupt values, creating a prison of his own making. Each choice to ignore moral truth made it harder to recognize that truth in the future. The lesson for us today is both sobering and empowering. While we always retain the fundamental capacity to choose, each moral decision we make either strengthens or weakens our ability to make similar choices in the future. Just as the athlete's training decisions today affect their performance capabilities tomorrow, our moral choices shape our future capacity for ethical decision making. True freedom isn't just the absence of external constraints, but the positive capability to choose what's right, a capability that, like any skill, must be developed through consistent practice, period. In the end, Pharaoh's heart hardened serves as a powerful reminder that while the door to change is always open, walking through it becomes increasingly difficult the longer we wait. The time to exercise our moral freedom is always now before our hearts become hardened by habit and our choices limited by the momentum of our past decisions. That is a really great explanation. In other words, and I'll talk about a little bit more specifically in a few lessons down the road, we have, and I say this as a full-on Arminian when it comes to the argument of predestination and election, This is a passage, Pharaoh's hardened heart. It's a passage that people run to and say Pharaoh had no choice. He was elected to be hardened. That is not what the Bible record says. The Bible record says that Pharaoh made choice after choice after choice. We'll see he is given opportunity, and Moses gives him opportunity. He'll say 2 or 3 times, "Would you pray for me? I'm going to let you go this time." And then he changes his mind. Pharaoh continued to make choices that made his heart harder and harder and harder. And apparently, there came a point of no return. We don't know when that point is, but this was not God just saying, "Sorry, Pharaoh, you're out," from the beginning. This was a this was free choice that was made over and over. Our decisions now have consequences in the future. And that's as far as we're going to go with it today. We'll get into this much more. So Moses, we're going to wind this down, though early, um, arguing early does not, I don't know what I even meant by that. So that's one of the worst sentences I've ever written, I think. All right. The question is God testing him? Um, and and Moses is clearly having to get to the point where he says, "I'm going to obey whether the results occur or not." God is telling him he's going to say no over, and this is not going to be easy, Moses. You're going to have to choose to obey whether or not um, the results follow or not. Can I just tell you, it's a hard lesson for me because I want results. I want success, but God um, values obedience even more than he does results. If the story would have stopped, listen, this is important. If the story would have stopped after his ninth attempt and 9 plagues, and they would have never been let go, Moses would have still been obedient. And Moses individually would have obeyed God and been blessed for that obedience. Now, ultimately, they got delivered. But sometimes, not sometimes, all the time, God is more interested in us obeying what he calls us to do than the results that we get out of that obedience. I want results because I know the people that I lead want results, the people I answer to want results. But ultimately, what is crucial is that we obey whether the results come or not. And Moses makes a decision here: I'm going to obey whether the results come or not. And as another little aside, I put it here. God is previewing what's going to happen, and it just sounds so rough. But he basically says, because Pharaoh will mistreat my firstborn, which is the nation of Israel, I will take the life of his firstborn. That's a preview of the angel of the Lord that will take the first of every Egyptian home. There is a principle that is called the lex talionis. It's the eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. It's like you take it in the garden. God said to the serpent, "Because you made Adam and Eve, or forced Adam and Eve to eat something they should not eat, you're going to eat dust the rest of your life." That's an example of that lex talionis, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. And so this is that same kind of thing. He is abusing my firstborn, so he will lose his firstborn. That's just a kind of a way to understand what's going on there.